At 6:14 a.m., the sound of tires rolling through my ranch gate told me something was already wrong. 3 sheriff cruisers and a black HOA SUV were already parked on my gravel drive like they owned the land. The air smelled like dry dust and morning mesquite, but the silence was heavier than the engine noise they brought with them. The HOA president stood beside the lead officer, arms crossed, pointing at my house like it had no right to exist there. I stepped out onto the porch slowly, boots hitting the wood with a sound that carried across the empty fields. No one spoke at first, not the officers, not the HOA enforcer, just the wind moving through the dry grass. Melissa Grant finally broke the silence, holding up a folder stamped with community enforcement seals. "We are here to remove unauthorized occupancy," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning calm. The officer looked uneasy, shifting his weight like he was trying to decide where jurisdiction actually began. My hand rested on the porch railing, steady, while I watched them treat my land like a disputed map. Inside, I could hear the faint hum of a radio crackling with procedural chatter I knew all too well. They thought this was just another HOA dispute, another homeowner refusing compliance. But the way the deputy glanced at me suggested something in my past was about to surface. I didn't move faster, didn't argue, didn't even raise my voice. I just looked at the gate, the same gate I'd opened thousands of times without issue. And then I noticed something subtle, the moment the younger officer saw my name on the mailbox. He paused, just for a second, but it changed everything about the air between us. That was when I realized this wasn't going to be a simple eviction call, because the people standing on my property didn't know who I used to be. And the woman leading them, the HOA president, was about to learn that some lines in this county were not meant to be crossed. I could see the tension building in the way she kept glancing between the officers and her paperwork, as if documents alone could decide ownership of land that had been in my hands long before she ever arrived. I stayed quiet, letting them fill the silence with their assumptions, because sometimes silence reveals more than argument ever could. The wind picked up across the open ranch, moving dust along the fence line, and I could tell this was the moment everything would either escalate or collapse. One of the officers adjusted his radio, speaking quietly, and I caught a phrase I wasn't supposed to hear in a case like this. It wasn't about trespassing anymore, not really, and I could feel the shift happening before anyone else admitted it out loud. The deputy's eyes met mine again, and this time there was no confusion, only recognition trying to surface through protocol. I knew that look, the hesitation of someone who suddenly realizes the situation in front of them doesn't match the paperwork in their hands. And in that silence between policy and reality, I understood this wasn't going to end the way Melissa Grant expected. Because the system she thought she controlled had a history I never told anyone I was part of. And as I stood there watching them treat my ranch like a legal puzzle they believed they could solve, I realized the real question wasn't whether I belonged here, but whether they were prepared for the truth that was already standing in front of them there. The morning light had fully settled over the ranch, turning the dry Texas ground into a pale gold sheet that stretched farther than the eye could follow. I could feel every pair of eyes locked on me, even from behind the reflective lenses of the sheriff cruisers. Melissa Grant did not look away. She stepped slightly forward, lifting her folder again as if repeating authority would make it real. "This is your final opportunity to comply," she said, each word measured like she had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. The lead officer finally exhaled, adjusting his stance, his hand resting near his belt in a way that suggested discomfort rather than control. I noticed how he kept glancing between me and the paperwork, like something about this scene refused to line up. The younger officer, Daniel Brooks, stayed half a step behind, his attention fixed on the mailbox at the end of my driveway. My name was printed there in plain metal letters, weathered by years of sun and wind, nothing about it suggesting trespass or dispute. I walked down one step from the porch, slow and deliberate, feeling the gravel shift under my boots. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, like the land itself was listening. Melissa raised her voice slightly, insisting that the HOA had documented violations and that law enforcement was authorized to assist in removal. The lead officer finally interrupted her, not aggressively, but with the tone of someone trying to confirm a detail that did not belong in his report. He asked for clarification on the jurisdictional authority listed in her file. She responded quickly, too quickly, sliding a stamped document forward as if speed could replace legitimacy. I watched the officer scan it, his eyes narrowing just slightly at the margins. The paper looked official at a glance, but not to someone trained to recognize inconsistencies. The wind shifted again across the ranch, carrying the distant sound of cattle and the faint rattle of a loose gate hinge near the east fence line. I had fixed that hinge 3 times last year, always meaning to replace it, never finding the time. Now it was the only thing moving besides us. Daniel Brooks took a step closer to me, lowering his voice just enough that only I could hear. He asked if I had ever worked under the county sheriff division. I did not answer immediately, letting the question sit between us. Melissa noticed the hesitation and tried to regain control, insisting that personal history was irrelevant to property enforcement. But I could see the shift already forming in the officers, subtle but irreversible. The lead officer adjusted his radio again, requesting verification from dispatch regarding a prior record associated with my name. That was when the atmosphere changed completely. It was no longer about property lines or HOA complaints. It was about something buried deeper in the county system. I watched Daniel Brooks glance at his screen, his expression tightening as he scrolled. The silence stretched longer than it should have in any routine call. Melissa noticed it too, her confidence starting to fracture at the edges as she realized the paperwork was no longer enough to carry the moment. I stood there without moving, letting the truth come to the surface on its own timing. Because I already knew what they were about to find, and more importantly, I knew what it would mean for the way this entire situation had been built from the start. And as the radio finally crackled back with an answer from dispatch, I saw the exact moment everything in front of me stopped being under her control. The radio crackled back with a sound that seemed to cut through the entire ranch, carrying a tone that immediately changed the posture of everyone standing on my driveway. Dispatch confirmed my name, then repeated it again, followed by a classification code that made the lead officer go still in a way I had seen many times before when something routine stopped being routine. The younger officer, Daniel Brooks, lowered his gaze to his device, scrolling with a tension in his jaw that did not match the calm morning air. Melissa Grant noticed the shift almost instantly and tried to speak over it, insisting that HOA documentation carried civil authority within the subdivision boundaries. But her voice no longer had the same weight it carried minutes earlier. The lead officer raised his hand slightly, not to silence her, but to pause everything while he listened to the radio confirmation being read back from county records. I did not move. I did not need to. I had heard that tone before, not from this side of the conversation, but from the other side of enforcement calls when my name used to appear in reports instead of property disputes. Daniel finally looked up at me again, this time with a different kind of recognition, the kind that comes when a memory connects to a file he has definitely seen before in training. He asked my full name again, slower this time, and when I answered without hesitation, I saw the exact moment his understanding shifted from uncertainty to confirmation. The lead officer exhaled through his nose and stepped half a pace back, adjusting his stance as if the ground itself had changed classification. Melissa attempted to regain control of the situation by insisting the HOA had coordinated this removal through proper channels, but the words no longer landed the same way they did at the beginning of the call. Dispatch came through again, clearer this time, referencing a former deputy sheriff designation tied to county operations within this exact jurisdiction. The phrase hung in the air longer than anything else that morning. Daniel turned his head slightly toward the lead officer and spoke quietly, confirming what he had just seen on his screen. The lead officer looked at me directly now, not as a property owner, but as someone whose past record had just overwritten the assumptions of the present moment. I could see the calculation forming in his expression, the mental separation between HOA authority and county authority becoming impossible to ignore. Melissa stepped forward again, but this time even she seemed unsure whether she was speaking to people who were still obligated to follow her direction. The wind moved across the ranch again, lifting a small cloud of dust near the fence line, and for the first time since they arrived, no one reacted to her voice immediately. Instead, the lead officer requested a formal pause on all enforcement actions pending verification from county command. That sentence alone changed everything about the balance in front of my gate. Melissa looked at him in disbelief, her confidence slipping into frustration as she realized her paperwork was no longer the center of control. Daniel kept his eyes on me for a second longer, then finally spoke in a lower tone, acknowledging that my prior service record placed me under a different procedural category than what the HOA had presented. I remained still, letting the system speak for itself, because I knew once county verification fully aligned with what was already in their screens, there would be no way to return this moment to what Melissa had expected when she drove onto my ranch that morning. The pause from county command did not feel like silence anymore. It felt like the entire ranch had shifted into a different legal atmosphere, as if the air itself had been reclassified. The lead officer stepped slightly away from Melissa Grant and spoke into his radio again, this time slower, confirming a direct request for supervisory verification from the county sheriff office. Melissa's posture changed the moment she realized the conversation was no longer happening at her level of authority. She clutched her folder tighter, but the papers inside no longer looked like leverage, only paper. Daniel Brooks stayed focused on his device, scrolling through what I already knew would be the county personnel history tied to my name. I could see the exact moment he found it, the brief pause in his eyes that always followed recognition of internal records that were never meant to be casually referenced in the field. He leaned slightly toward the lead officer and spoke under his breath, confirming what the system had already started to expose. My past assignment within county enforcement was not just a footnote. It was a supervisory role that intersected directly with jurisdictional oversight of rural properties like mine. The lead officer exhaled slowly, shifting his weight again, this time no longer in confusion but in recalibration. Melissa attempted to interrupt, insisting that HOA authority was still valid under civil code enforcement agreements, but no one responded immediately. Instead, the lead officer raised his hand again, this time signaling a full procedural hold. That single motion changed the tone completely. I noticed the shift in how they looked at the gate, at the fence line, at the ranch itself. It was no longer about trespass or compliance. It was about whether they had entered a situation that had been misrepresented from the beginning. Daniel finally spoke clearly, stating that my designation within county records placed me under a former deputy classification with direct operational familiarity in cases involving property enforcement disputes. Melissa froze for the first time since arriving, her certainty breaking into visible frustration. She looked at the officers as if expecting them to correct themselves, but instead she saw them adjusting to information she had not accounted for. The wind moved across the open land again, carrying dust along the driveway, and for the first time, no one tried to speak over it. The lead officer requested confirmation from dispatch for a second time, and when the response came back, it was immediate and unambiguous. My name was tied to prior enforcement oversight within this exact county region, and any civil action being attempted on-site required escalation beyond standard HOA coordination. Melissa's grip on her folder loosened slightly, the edges of the paper bending under her fingers as the reality of the situation began to settle in. She tried one last time to assert authority, stating that the HOA board had approved legal intervention, but the words no longer carried any procedural weight. The officers did not challenge her directly. They simply stopped responding as if her input was no longer relevant to the jurisdiction they were now operating under. I stood in the same place I had been since this began, watching the system adjust itself in real time around information that had been overlooked. Daniel looked at me once more, this time without uncertainty, and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something that had just been verified rather than discovered. The lead officer stepped back toward his vehicle, signaling that no further enforcement action could proceed without county-level review. And in that moment, standing on the gravel drive of my own ranch, I could see the exact point where Melissa Grant's control over this situation stopped existing entirely. The shift was immediate, but it did not feel loud. It felt like pressure leaving a sealed room. The lead officer stepped back another half step, his hand no longer near his belt, but resting openly at his side in a posture that signaled disengagement from enforcement mode. The sheriff cruiser behind him idled without urgency now, as if waiting for instructions that would never come from this location again. Melissa Grant stood still in the middle of my driveway, her folder lowered slightly, her confidence no longer supported by the system she had brought with her. For the first time since she arrived, she was not speaking. She was waiting, and that difference mattered more than anything she had said all morning. Daniel Brooks kept his eyes on the radio confirmation, then looked up at the lead officer and gave a small nod that confirmed what neither of them needed to say out loud. The situation had moved beyond HOA jurisdiction, beyond field enforcement, and into county review protocol that required suspension of all immediate action. The lead officer turned slightly toward Melissa and explained it in a calm, controlled voice. No removal would proceed without formal verification from county legal authority. There was no hostility in his tone, only procedure, and that made it final in a way argument never could be. Melissa's jaw tightened as she tried to reassert control by referencing her documentation again. But this time, she did not finish the sentence. The officer did not respond. Instead, he turned slightly toward his vehicle, signaling a transition out of engagement. I noticed how quickly the energy drained from the scene once authority stopped aligning with her expectations. The gravel under my boots felt different again, not heavier, just quieter, as if the ranch had returned to its natural state after a disturbance had been removed. Daniel lingered for a moment longer than the others. His eyes moved from the mailbox to the fence line, then back to me. There was no suspicion in his expression anymore, only confirmation of something he had likely been trained to recognize, but never expected to encounter in a routine HOA call. He spoke quietly to the lead officer, mentioning procedural clearance status tied to my previous county assignment, and the officer gave a short acknowledgement before stepping fully away from the conversation. Melissa finally broke her silence, asking if they were refusing to assist in enforcement. Her voice carried frustration now instead of authority, but even that frustration sounded out of place in the open air of the ranch. The lead officer answered without hesitation, stating that enforcement required verified legal jurisdiction and that the current documentation did not meet that threshold. That sentence ended the conversation more effectively than any confrontation could have. I watched Melissa glance toward her SUV, then back at the officers, as if expecting the environment to correct itself if she waited long enough. It did not. Daniel closed his device and stepped back toward the cruiser, his attention no longer on the situation. The lead officer followed, speaking briefly into his radio with a final update that all immediate action had been suspended pending county review. The vehicles began to shift position slowly, not leaving in a rush, but disengaging with the quiet certainty of a call that had resolved itself in an unexpected direction. Melissa remained standing alone in the middle of my driveway for a moment longer, still holding the folder that no longer carried weight in any direction. I did not move toward her. I did not speak. I simply stood where I was as the last of the officers turned away from the ranch, and I understood that what had just ended was not a confrontation, but the version of authority she had believed would decide everything. The moment the last sheriff cruiser turned off my ranch and disappeared down the long gravel road, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened that morning. It was not relief exactly, not yet, but a kind of reset, like the land was finally allowed to breathe again after being held under pressure. Melissa Grant stood where they had left her, still holding her folder, but now it looked less like authority and more like something she did not know what to do with. I watched her glance toward her SUV, then toward the empty space where the officers had been, as if waiting for the scene to correct itself and return to her control. It did not. The wind moved across the ranch again, slow and dry, carrying the sound of distant cattle and the faint creak of the gate hinge I still had not replaced. I stayed on the porch for a moment longer, not because I needed to act, but because I knew this was the part most people never see, the moment after the system stops agreeing with the person who tried to use it. Melissa finally walked a few steps toward her vehicle, then stopped and turned back toward me. Her voice was lower now, stripped of the certainty she had arrived with, asking what I had done to make them recognize my name like that. I did not answer immediately. There was no version of that question that could be explained in a sentence she was prepared to understand in that moment. Instead, I simply watched as she tried to rebuild control out of language, mentioning escalation, oversight, and board authority, words that had worked for her before but now sounded like they were being spoken into open space. Her phone rang before she finished her thought. I could see the screen lighting up in her hand, and the change in her expression told me everything before she even answered it. The confidence that had carried her onto my property was gone, replaced by something closer to confusion mixed with urgency. She turned slightly away from me as she spoke into the phone, her tone shifting as she listened, and I could tell the conversation was not going the way she expected. I did not need to hear it to understand what was happening. County review does not move quickly, but it moves decisively once it starts. And now it had started. I stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the fence line, not to follow her, but because I needed distance from the place where she was standing. The ground under my boots felt steady again, like it belonged to itself rather than to anyone trying to reinterpret it through paperwork. Behind me, I heard her voice rise slightly during the call, then drop again as if she was being corrected from the other side of the line. The ranch did not care about any of it. The sky stayed wide and unchanged, the same pale blue it had been every morning for years. When I reached the fence, I rested my hand on the wood post and looked out across the open land. This was the part one always came back to, the part that did not require permission or interpretation. A few minutes later, I heard her vehicle door close. Not fast, not dramatic, just final in a different way. She did not leave immediately. I could feel that hesitation even without looking, the realization that nothing she said next would restore what had just been removed from her reach. And when she finally drove away, it was not with authority or resolution, but with the quiet awareness that the system she tried to use had already moved on without her. The first thing I noticed after she left was how the ranch sounded different again. Not quieter, but normal in a way that made the last hour feel like it had happened in a separate layer of time. The dust had already started settling back onto the gravel road, smoothing out the tire tracks like nothing had ever disturbed them. I stood by the fence line, watching the empty stretch where her SUV had disappeared, and I could still feel the echo of what had just collapsed without a single raised voice. My phone vibrated in my pocket, once, then again. Unknown county number. I already knew what it meant before I answered. The voice on the other end was calm, procedural, and careful, the kind of tone used when something has shifted from field discretion to formal review. They confirmed what I expected. The HOA request had been flagged for jurisdictional conflict review and improper enforcement escalation. In simpler terms, it meant nothing she had tried to do on my property could move forward without being examined line by line at the county level. I did not respond much, just listened, letting the information settle into place. When the call ended, I lowered the phone and looked back across the ranch. The sun was higher now, burning away the last traces of morning coolness, and the land looked the same as it always had, except I understood it differently now. Not because it had changed, but because the people trying to define it had been removed from the conversation. I walked back toward the porch slowly, passing the same steps where everything had started, and I could still see the faint marks in the gravel where the sheriff vehicles had been parked. Those marks would fade in a day or two, like everything else that did not belong here. Inside the house, the silence felt heavier in a different way. Not tense anymore, just final. I poured a glass of water and stood by the window, looking out at the gate. There was no urgency left in me, no need to chase or correct anything. The system had already done what it was going to do, and it had done it without noise. Another notification came through, this time a text message from an internal county channel confirming temporary suspension of HOA enforcement activity pending formal review board assessment. I read it once, then set the phone down. That was the point most people misunderstood about situations like this. Nothing dramatic happens at the end. There is no final speech, no confrontation that resets everything. There is only process, and process does not care who spoke the loudest at the beginning. I stepped outside again and leaned against the porch railing, looking out at the empty road. A few birds moved across the fence line, unbothered by anything that had taken place earlier. The ranch felt like it had reclaimed its own rhythm. I thought about how quickly certainty can disappear when it is built on assumptions instead of structure. Melissa had arrived here with documents, confidence, and expectation. She left with none of those things intact. Not because of force, not because of argument, but because the framework underneath her authority had never been as stable as she believed. I stayed there for a long time, not waiting for anything else to happen, but because sometimes the absence of movement is the clearest sign that something has already ended. And in that stillness, I understood that what had just unfolded on my property was never about confrontation at all. It was about exposure, and once exposed, there was nothing left for it to stand on. By the time the sun began to dip lower over the ranch, the kind of heat that makes the horizon shimmer had settled across every open field. The events from the morning no longer felt immediate, but they had not faded either. They had just changed form, from confrontation into consequence. I stood near the porch again, looking out at the long gravel road, when my phone rang a second time. This time it was not county dispatch. It was a direct line from someone I had not heard from in years. The voice was older, slower, but instantly recognizable. A former colleague from my county days. He did not waste time with greetings. He asked one question first: whether I had been involved in any active enforcement interaction that morning tied to a homeowner association dispute. I confirmed it without detail, and there was a pause on the other end that told me everything I needed to know about how far this had already traveled. He explained that once my name appeared in the county verification system, the entire structure around the HOA complaint had been escalated into a formal compliance audit. That meant every document Melissa Grant had submitted was now being reviewed not just for accuracy, but for authority to exist in the first place. I listened without interrupting, letting each sentence settle into place like something irreversible. He added that Melissa's position as HOA president had already been flagged for procedural overreach, pending review board examination. That was the moment I realized this was no longer about my ranch. It had expanded beyond my property line and into the system that had allowed her authority to function unchecked. I stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward the gate again, needing to see the space where everything had unfolded earlier with different eyes. The tire tracks were almost gone now, softened by wind and dust, but I could still trace where each vehicle had been positioned, where hesitation had replaced certainty, where enforcement had stopped being automatic. The gate creaked slightly when I pushed it open, the same sound I had heard 100 times before, except now it felt like punctuation on something that had already been written. I thought about Melissa driving away earlier, her confidence collapsing in real time as she realized that paperwork alone does not create authority when jurisdiction does not agree. My phone buzzed again, a message this time, confirming that all HOA enforcement activity linked to my property had been placed under temporary suspension pending administrative review. There was no celebration in it, no satisfaction written into the language, just procedure doing what procedure eventually does when it is forced to look at itself too closely. I leaned against the fence post and looked out across the ranch, watching the light shift across the grass. Everything here had existed long before any of this started, and it would continue long after the paperwork was filed away. That thought stayed with me longer than anything else. Not the confrontation, not the officers, not even the moment of recognition. Just the quiet certainty that systems built on assumption eventually meet systems built on record, and when they do, one of them stops speaking entirely. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of morning that does not announce change but quietly confirms it has already happened. The ranch was still, the air cool enough that the dust from the previous day had settled into the gravel and stopped moving. I stood at the edge of the porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the same road where everything had unfolded, and for the first time it felt empty in a way that was not tension, but completion. No sheriff vehicles, no HOA SUV, no voices trying to claim space that was never theirs to control. Just land, distance, and silence. My phone rang once, then again, this time from an unknown county administrative line. I answered without hesitation. The voice on the other end confirmed what I already understood from the previous night's messages. The formal review board had completed its preliminary jurisdictional assessment. All HOA enforcement actions tied to my property were now officially suspended pending compliance investigation. The language was precise, procedural, and final in a way that left no room for interpretation. I did not respond for a moment, letting the words sit in the space between me and the open fields. It was not victory in the way people imagine it. No celebration, no shift in emotion that came suddenly. It was more like watching a system correct itself after being forced to acknowledge something it had overlooked. I thanked the caller and ended the call. Then I walked down the steps and out toward the gate. The ranch felt different in a way that had nothing to do with ownership. It felt undisturbed, like it had returned to its original state after a brief interruption. I ran my hand along the wooden post at the fence line, feeling the rough surface under my palm. and thought about how quickly authority can dissolve when it is not built on structure that survives review. The same ground Melissa Grant had stood on just days before now held no trace of her presence beyond faint tire marks fading into the soil. I remembered how certain she had been when she arrived, how the language of enforcement had seemed absolute in her hands, how she had believed documents alone could reshape physical space. Now those same documents were sitting somewhere in a county review office being measured against jurisdiction they were never designed to override. I took a slow walk along the fence line, following the perimeter of the property as I often did when I needed to think clearly. The cattle in the distance moved without urgency, unaffected by anything that had happened beyond their field of awareness. The wind carried the same dry scent of grass and dust that it always had, unchanged by the conflict that had passed through it. As I reached the far corner of the ranch, I stopped and looked back toward the house. There was no sign of movement, no indication that anything had disrupted the normal rhythm of the place beyond memory. My phone vibrated one last time. A final notification from county administration confirming that a formal hearing date would be scheduled for HOA compliance review. It was not dramatic, not loud, just procedural continuation of a process that had already shifted away from the assumptions that started it. I turned the phone off and slipped it into my pocket. Standing there at the edge of my land, I understood something that had nothing to do with confrontation or authority. It was simpler than that. When systems built on assumption are forced into contact with systems built on record, the outcome is never decided by volume or confidence. It is decided by structure. And as I stood there watching the horizon settle into late morning light, I knew that nothing about what had happened needed to be repeated, because everything that mattered had already been resolved in the only place it ever truly is, within the system itself.